Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Emphasis webinar, Where Are You on the DOL Compliance Journey? Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. So, earlier this year, the Department of Labor released its Conflict of Interest Rule with the focus on stopping the $17 billion a year bloodletting that the government claims investors have paid in waste and exorbitant fees. The idea is that this regulation will stop advisors and Wall Street firms from putting their own interest in earning high commissions and fees over clients' interest in obtaining the best investments at the lowest prices. Although very altruistic in intent, it is also extremely disruptive. In other words, the historic regulation was meant to protect the investor no matter what it costs the industry. Even though the final rule contains several important concessions that will help make the implementation easier for Wall Street, the bottom line is that if they can't prove their retirement advice prioritizes the clients over themselves, then they will potentially face massive class action lawsuits. Not only is this disruptive, it is potentially catastrophic. More importantly, this regulation will have a far deeper impact to the clients that we serve, and it will forever change the way that financial services are provided. Understanding this, we have brought together some of the industry's top experts to talk about what they are seeing, how their customers are attacking the problem, and with only 5 months left before you have to comply with the standard of care component, what they are doing to prove that they are acting in the client's best interest. So now I would like to introduce our esteemed colleagues, Will Trout, Thomas Greigel, Mary Kotzman, and Robert Kirk. Now, to kick things off, I would like to ask Will Trout to tell us what he's seen in the industry.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this section of the webinar. I'm happy to give an overview and perspective on the Department of Labor Conflict of Interest Rule and where we are today. If we move into the presentation, I include on the page opening thoughts, a brief quote from a recent report that we've done at Celent, trying to encapsulate the Department of Labor rule. Fundamentally, it establishes a regulatory fault line between advised and transaction businesses in the retirement space. That means it provides for a uniform standard of care, the fiduciary standard of care, in the retirement space, which has been dramatically expanded to include IRAs and likewise to include an array of health, education, and savings accounts. So it significantly expands the activities, the universe of activities that might make somebody, make an advisor, a fiduciary. Let's move into the heart of the presentation. The next slide provides a timeline for implementation of the Department of Labor Conflict of Interest Rule. It centers on 3 areas: conduct, communication, and compliance, and spans the better part of 2 years, with the implementation of DOL effective June 15th and full compliance with exemptions around contracts, disclosures, and so forth, all the way out to January 2018. Now, the full deadline for compliance, in other words, the application of the standard of care, begins April 17th. When I mention conduct, communication, and compliance, I'm talking in the first order about the impartial conduct standards that are key to the DOL. I list these here. In addition, it's very important that firms advise investors that they are, in fact, offering investments on a fiduciary basis. And lastly, firms must designate a person responsible for adherence to these standards. Diving a little deeper, On the next slide, we look to why the DOL is so important, at least in terms of the investor experience. Because while transparency and elimination of inappropriate sales tactics are indeed objectives, a primary objective around DOL has been cost. Reduction of cost can take place in terms of fees, can take place in terms of the elimination of kickbacks and other types of conflicted revenue streams, which now require an exemption. Most fundamentally, the DOL attempts to undercut the opportunity cost inherent in the use of expensive, actively managed funds. And I have a chart here to the right that shows the performance of these funds in aggregate relative to the Vanguard 500 index. If you consider, in fact, the difference between the average fee for a U.S. mutual fund, it's 67 basis points between actively managed funds, averaging about 77 bips, and the 10 bips charged on average by passively managed funds. Let's move onward. Next slide, we look at the overall background to DOL, in which we have a range of dynamically and highly fluid secular forces changing the investments landscape. You know these forces: the emergence of the millennials, fee compression, profound shifts in the nature of work and jobs, which make the 401k less central to individual investors' lives, trends to passive investing, as I spoke of, and an increased regulatory burden. These trends are forcing firms to alter their strategic direction. Some are transforming their models of advice, adopting robo-advisory platforms and other automated systems. Others are seeking to empower their advisors by using digital channels, giving them iPads, providing investor portals, and so forth. Either way, this change in strategic direction has profound implications for firms' business and delivery models. On the product level, to be sure, not least in terms of the adoption of passive investments. On the platform level, in terms of technology requirements, and in terms of the fundamental value proposition that a firm needs to offer its clients and other stakeholders in order to stay in business. Let's move on to the next slide. This slide, the new reality, signals some of the risks at play. Certainly the litigation risk mentioned in the introduction, whereby decisions as to the appropriateness of investment have been moved from disciplinary panels and arbitration to the class action lawsuits to the courts. In terms of commercial considerations, we're seeing pressure from technology that's driving down costs and allowing the introduction of automated advice delivery, robo solutions. This exerts pressure on margins. And lastly, the burden of keeping up with compliance and the endless amount of documentation inherent in accommodating the new regulation. Next slide, please. This is the question: how can technology help manage these competing demands? How can you balance the trade-off between increased compliance and profitability? Well, one way is simple user tech. On the next slide, I say, no more clunky portals. The advisor should be able to access information in real time. The client should have access to portals, access to educational materials. Training is another important consideration that can be delivered to the advisor over the web. The key is to have a seamless digital experience that takes into consideration compliance requirements and also business and operational priorities. Let's move on to the next slide. which centers on opportunity. What is the opportunity we have before us? Well, it takes place on several levels. I've mentioned some of these up front. You need training. You need education for both advisors and clients. You need robust document management systems. You need a strong exemption compliance program. And all of this needs to be supervised. Now, if this sounds like changing the tires on a moving car, it may well be, because you've also got to keep in mind considerations around product and the type of platform you use. And hopefully, you're using one platform and not 10, because you're going to need to get a good handle on your client data. You're going to have visibility onto the whole of client assets the client has kept with you, and you're going to make this simple for the advisor by automating the decision tree as much as possible. And my colleagues later in this presentation will talk about that in more detail. I'd like to point out, though, if we look to the next slide, the proposition you present to the client. What is value? It's not just lower cost. It cannot be lower cost. It should be, and it should be partly about transparency as well. But the point is that value is a multifaceted proposition that's going to be based very much on the needs of the individual client or even the individual client segment, but needs to have the full shade of offering and comprehensiveness that the client needs to have a good outcome, because that's important. Keep in mind on product, too much can be as bad as too little. Let's move to the end of this section of the presentation, looking at the next slide, how things could look. The objective here is advice delivered in an automated, cost-efficient, and compliant environment. What does that mean? That means different things for different people, as I said before. For the client, not just low fees, but realization of the opportunity before her. For the firm, the advisor, you want to avoid litigation while remaining compliant. And last and most important is the contribution of the vendor. Yeah? What should that be? A scalable, effective platform that provides solutions for the advisor and his client on an ongoing and scalable basis. Let's move to the next slide. At this point, I'm going to hand this off to my colleague and friend, Robert Kirk, with Emphasis. You may not know Emphasis as a compliance firm, but Emphasis has been thinking long and hard about how to address the manifold challenges inherent in the U.S. Department of Labor conflict of interest rule. Take it away, Rob.
Thanks, Will. As everyone probably knows, Emphasis is really not known for being a compliance firm. But he's right. We do a lot of the work on Wall Street today. We do a lot of the processing work, the app development, web portals, testing, governance, risk, and compliance with automation. We do a lot of the things that empowers the firms on Wall Street. But recently what's been happening is Emphasis has gone out and really tried to go to the industry, and they've looked for people like myself, ex-CIOs, ex-CTOs, who've been responsible for a lot of the business, who've been responsible for tech, who've integrated various different systems and how they work together with the business. So with your chief compliance officers, with your sales, with the various staff and operations. And if you look at what we do, one of the things that we are always having to do is take a look at new regulation. I mean, regulation is just not going to stop. Ever since the 33 and 34 Act, we've just seen a litany of things change. And as time changes and technology changes, well, there's going to be more regulation that comes about. But in doing this, what we've looked at is a specific way to how to actually do that assessment. Well, there's four basic things that when I was on the corporate side of the world that I had to do. First was interpret the law, and quite frankly, emphasis, that's not us, right? We are not ERISA lawyers. We are not compliance officers. But we do work with the executive suite, the C-suite. And so we sit down with them quite a number of different ways and talk about how is this going to be and what will it affect in your company. From that point, there's always the next decision that once there is that interpretation of law, there's the uncovering of what risks the business has. Well, then they have to design what are the next types of things that they need to do. Are they changing their specific business models? Are they changing their company offerings? And more importantly, when they change their policies and procedures, what's relevant, what's not? And then after that, they're going to have to say, how do we supervise this going forward? And typically, this is when emphasis would get involved. It gets involved in the implement stage. And during this portion, this is when we're really looking at the technology solutions that all of the various departments use. So whether it's a CRM system, an onboarding system, an ACAT system, whether it's your KYC systems or your performance reporting systems. Everything goes towards helping the client. But with all of this changes, you have to implement the various pieces that are going to need to change, whether it's technology or data elements. And from there, what we really do is we really get to the next stage, which is the comply part, where we sit down with our business partners and say, here's what we've done. Can we test it? Can we audit it? Can we show that you're in control? And the way we've approached this, as you said before, is from a technology perspective, but what we've realized is that with today's technology, we can actually help people understand, one, are they operating in the spirit of the law, and two, are they proving compliance with the regulation? Because ultimately, if you can do those two things, you can prove your methodology and you can show what you've done, then guess what? You should be in compliance with the regulation. Now, understanding this, you have to start to take a look at the next piece, which really is about how do we look at the business from a high level. So on the next slide, what you're going to see is every business has three main pieces. They have a front office, a middle office, and a back office. Every single one of us on this call today knows what this is, but what we may not understand is how to use this in a way to really help uncover different areas of risk, different pieces that go forward. So if you look at the next piece, there's a 7-step chevron. The first thing that every firm has to do is prospect for new clients. They've got to go out and find the people, find the customers, whether they're institutional, high net worth, whether they're just simple retail, or maybe they're the robos. They've got to find out how to get those clients. And then they have to propose something. We're a better system, we're a better product, we're a better wealth manager, we are a better credit card or a mortgage, whatever it is. And then once that transaction is agreed to, then you have to actually get into opening the account before you can actually do anything. So you open the account, then of course you fund it, you trade it, whatever the asset allocation might be, there's a settlement, there's a review. And then as life goes on, all of the advisors do the same thing. They basically wash, rinse, and repeat, and they keep going through this process over and over again. And this is where we saw it unique, because as you take a look at this, regulation will go in that path as it goes through. So how do we relate the two? Well, the next thing that we do is we actually start to take a look at the departments that are there. And so the next section says, if you align all of your various departments within those specific chevrons, those silos that support that customer, life starts to get a little bit easier, because then you realize that it's a serial progression. And from here, you realize that the next thing that's going to happen is that everybody's going to start using systems. And as those systems come out, you start to really see how your entire environment is put together, your ecosystem. Some people will use proprietary products, some people will use off-the-shelf products, some people will use their clearing firm's products, but each of these has a specific role to play. And the basic thing that they all do is they all collect what's next, and that's the actual data. You can't put a trade on until you've got an account number, and you can't get an account number until you've filled out the appropriate information. And by the way, that's all done legally. FINRA has already required us to collect a certain amount of information before we can proceed to the next step, and that's what we do. So finally, what you can do at this is you can actually start to align all of these things to understand the regulation, where certain pieces of regulation occur, what data is collected where, the systems that are impacted, the systems going to the department. And so if you make a change, then what you really see is something very unique. You actually start to see how a change in regulation affects your entire business. And that was the culmination of what we decided to do when Will said, you know, is there a technology way to kind of answer this question? So yes, from this perspective, we've actually gone to the next piece where we're able to show people how to use this in terms of actually showing them that they're in compliance, showing them that they're going through. So this next piece, I'm going to show you a very quick demo of what we have, and then we'll get through this just in a few seconds. All right, so from here, we have an iPad app that's been brought up, and the first thing that you'll notice was there was a landing page which talked about the timelines. But the main thing that really is going to happen from here is that you're going to really start to take a look at your business. What accounts are affected? How many products do we carry? How many are third party? And I'm not going to spend time going into the executive dashboard, but we'll basically break that down by the number of assets, the rep numbers, the offices, the OSJs, and whatnot. What I'm really going to concentrate on is just that information that I showed you right there. So from this perspective, what we're seeing is a technology view that you can actually take on your iPad and show people, show regulators, show lawyers, show people doing audit that this is what we're doing. So if I go to the front office and I touch there on my iPad, what I'll see very quickly is I will see a process. This could be your process. This is the process by which we teach our advisors how to do business, how to actually get involved and make the sales. Because once you know this, you can actually start to show people this is what we do. This is how we educate them, and this is how we train them. And this will become important a little later on when we're really starting to understand how we're going to educate the sales forces going forward. But from here, that's just the basics of the front office. Underneath that front office, we may prospect in a number of different ways. We may do cold calling, we may do referrals, we may do webinars or seminars, conferences, or we might just do direct mail. And in this instance, I'm going to pick out under prospect a subcategory of processes, meaning this is how one customer would do a direct mail campaign. And from here, what we really see is all the players that are involved, the systems that are involved, how they're actually doing this campaign, and then from there, we actually take a look at what the next steps are. So as you make changes to your process, as you make changes to your systems, we actually document that information and help show it, visualize it. So the green, of course, means, hey, we're good, no issues on the DOL. Yellow means, hey, there's some things we've got to think about, and red, of course, means there's some changes that need to happen. But as we start to document this, we document not only the changes or the as-is state, we will also document the to-be state, which is what you need to do to become in compliance. And that becomes very effective for us because as we start to look at this, we have to prove compliance. And proving compliance means that you've asked the right questions. So if you look at any one of these channels, you'll see, for example, on sales, marketing, legal, and compliance, and I'll hit that really quickly, you'll see the number of different questions that we have asked as a firm. Do you know the number of people that have DOL-affected accounts? What are their rep numbers? And as we go through this, have you documented all of these things? Are you educating your advisors? These are questions that you as a participant, as an industry participant, you have to answer. More importantly, as you document this, you're actually able to show, hey, we have this. We have people that open 457 accounts. We have people that operate in a 316 perspective. And guess what? We've asked them these questions, and here are our answers. So now you actually get to prove to people what you've asked, what's pertinent to your business, where it's pertinent to business, and the systems that are interacted with. And more importantly, from that perspective, you can then add onto it very quickly. So if I go down into a seminar and scheduling, I can say, hey, our advisors are using the system, our customers are using the system, here's where the data comes from, and here's where it goes to. We're documenting all of this. And then more importantly, since we're really talking about the DOL and transparency, What we want to do is we want to highlight what you get, what you're doing, and what you did, because that shows proof and that you're still operating in the spirit of the law. So if I touch that middle section on my iPad, which is about sales and marketing, it actually shows as a sample some of the different things that we've done for people. Business analysis, process mapping, third-party integrations, CRM integrations. And it actually tells you what the benefits you received and the cost that was there. So this way you can actually bring this to an auditor, show the auditor what they've done, and then more importantly, prove compliance. This is actually the first time that I can recall in my career, and I've spent 25 plus years in the business, actually saying I can turn this over to an auditor or a regulator and say, here's what we've done. Tell me where I'm wrong. You're putting the onus on them rather than on you. Now, this is just how we've approached helping our clients prove that they're in compliance with the reg and to show that they're operating in the spirit of the law. But it's not always easy. Some people are still trying to grasp the intricate portions of the law. Some people still have delayed some decisions. Some people are actually just getting started. But again, if you go back to what I said previously, when you start to interpret the law and design the law and design your compliance procedures, that's really not us. And that's why we partnered up and aligned ourselves with firms, you know, like ACA and Mary Kotzman and several other technology providers. We formed a industry participant group that's going to specialize in helping our clients and their clients address the DOL. So from that perspective, Tom, who's a principal consultant at ACA who specializes in this space, I'm going to pass the ball over to you, but really what I want to ask you before I do is, what are you seeing out there? I'm coming from a technology perspective, but what do you see are the areas that you know firms are struggling with?
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, like Rob said, I'm a principal consultant with ACA Compliance Group, where we help our clients with their compliance needs, whether they're broker-dealers, registered investment advisors, and such. And I've been working with the DOL rule for quite a while and working with a lot of clients to help them basically first analyze their business, understand what impact the rule has on them, and then to help them with solutions, whether it's existing softwares they may use or processes or what new ones they're going to need in order to comply with the rule. So if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to briefly touch on, these are the things I'm going to talk about. These seem to me to be the points of pain a lot of my clients are dealing with right now, and I'm sure the people who are listening in might be dealing with similar ones. The first is, what is considered reasonable compensation? How do I document recommendations are in the client's best interest? Supervision of different standards for IRA, fiduciary, and non-IRA suitability accounts. How do firms manage grandfathered accounts? Should firms do away with transaction-based business compensation in IRA accounts, kind of like what Merrill Lynch has just announced? And then briefly touch on the recently released FAQs that the DOL has given us. So let's go to the next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about compensation. This seems to be the question that a lot of firms are struggling with, because when the rule came out and the DOL said you can charge no more than reasonable compensation, what does that mean? Well, this has been around in ERISA law for quite a while. So when you look at what's been going on with 401ks and other retirement plans, you can kind of get an idea of what they mean by reasonable compensation. But in addition, the DOL has given us some other guidance, and then in presentations I've listened to in the FAQ, and also in you know, and other attorneys I've been spoken with. They talk about it's based on the market. What is out there? What is everyone else charging? And that's a big thing that firms are going to have to try and figure out how they're going to do this. I know what I'm charging. I may not know what other people are charging. I know what the mutual fund companies are paying me. I know what the variable annuity companies are paying me. So what you really need to do is put that down. What exactly am I getting? And it's not that easy, because a lot of firms I know, I did an analysis for one of our clients where I took their top 25 mutual funds, and it was really interesting to see how equity funds could be paying on Class A shares one sales load from one company and it's a different one from another company. Then you have fixed income mutual funds are paying something different. Variable annuity companies could be paying stuff all over the map. So how do you figure this out? Well, that's where benchmarking comes in. Benchmarking is where you actually have a system, and whether you're using an outside third-party service who can gather this information or you try to gather it on your own, you're actually plotting that, okay, these are the rates that we can go against the industry and show that for mutual funds, if we're charging 2%, that's pretty good. That matches up with the industry. And again, it doesn't have to be exactly, if they're charging 2.1 or 2.2 versus 2, that's not a big difference. If you're charging 2%, 5%, everyone else is charging 2, that could be problematic. So what you need to do is just, again, benchmark your product against the industry. And then you're going to have a process on how often you're going to want to update that benchmarking. I would say at least annually. Now, the PIC exemption has given you the ability to do product differentiation based on neutral factors. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if I come up with a neutral factor, and complexity and time seem to be a couple that are thrown out a lot, I can justify that I can pay reps compensation for variable annuities more than I can for mutual funds, say 3% for variable annuities, 2% for mutual funds, and those are just examples. Because a variable annuity is more complex, I need to understand that product more, I need to be able to relay that information to my client. So that's, and again, those are neutral factors, but again, it would be a cross-product category. So what does that mean? So if I'm charging 3% for VAs, it's across all the different companies and vendors I'm using. If I'm charging 2% for mutual funds, then it's going to be across all the mutual funds that I'm using. Then another thing comes up about level fee compensation. It sounds pretty straightforward. What is considered level fee compensation? Well, it's fee-based only. You can't receive 12B1 fees, revenue sharing, or commissions. Now, if it's a non-discretionary advisory account, you can receive those, but then you would have to use what they call the full PIC exemption. If it's strictly level fee, you can use an aspect of the PIC exemption, which is called we refer to as the level fee PIC, or PIC light, which is pretty much the main thing about using the PIC light is you don't have the contract that you would have with the full PIC. That's the big difference. You still have to adhere to the impartial conduct standards of the PIC, which is that you're giving advice in the best interest of the client, not receiving more than reasonable compensation, and giving no misleading statements. But the big thing is you don't have the contract aspect of the full PIC, which a lot of people seem to like, because then you don't have the class action aspect of the full PIC. Key thing to remember is that the PIC exemption applies only to non-discretionary accounts. When it's a discretionary account, you have to have the level fees in there. There's some ERISA rules in existence already on how you can mitigate that if you are getting some kind of fee in there, but pretty much you would have to, it allows you to charge it, credit it back to the customer. So just remember, non-discretionary accounts, just level fees, no transaction-based comp at all. Next slide, please. So another pain point that a lot of my clients are dealing with is, how are recommendations in the best interest of the client? And a lot of firms are dealing with best interest versus suitability. What does that mean? Well, best interest is what the DOL is saying that has to be done. You have to do things in the best interest of your client. Suitability is a FINRA rule where you're basically saying something is suitable for a client. Now, what is the difference? Well, suitability, the way I like to explain it is if you take two variable annuities that you're proposing to a client that are virtually the same as far as features and riders and such. One pays me and charges the customer more money, obviously, 6%. The other pays me 4%. Now, in a suitability world, as long as I've determined that that investment is correct for this client's situation, then I can give him the VA that pays me more. Under the best interest, is that really in the client's best interest, giving him a VA that charges him more when I have another product that I've already determined is also suitable for him? So that's the way I like to explain the difference between best interest and suitability. So then we go on to what information do I need to collect? Well, again, the DOL has given us some guidance in the preamble of the rule where they go back to the suitability rule. So if you're obtaining investment objectives, risk tolerance, the financial circumstances. That's part of the information you need to obtain in order to say things are in, demonstrate that your recommendations are in the client's best interest. Now, the next part of that slide here, it says it's all in the plan. Well, that's exactly what I mean. What I'd like to say is that a good financial plan would be a basis to determine what's in the customer's best interest. So that's more information than you're probably getting already. That's more analysis you're going to need. But again, a financial plan properly done, whether it's goal-based or cash-based, you can, any recommendation you give, you can go back to that plan and say, here, this is the basis for all the recommendations I'm doing, and I'm reviewing it with my client, we're updating it, and he has access to it. So then the next part of this slide says, what do I do with all this information? And that's really a big pain point with a lot of my clients. What do I do with all this information? I got CRMs, I have financial planning software, I have data aggregators. How do I get that all together? And that's one of the points of this whole emphasis group we're talking about, is because technology is going to play a big part in this role. And the big pain point most firms are dealing with is, how do I gather all this information and get it in one spot? And we're going to talk about a little bit more about why that's important. Next slide, please. So we talked about the different standards, suitability versus best interest. Now, how about supervising it? Well, you have two different areas of supervision for this. You're going to have your principal reviews and supervision, and then you're going to have your compliance, spot checks, and follow-ups, and other types of reviews. So again, the point is, where is all this information going? How does my principal review people get this information? A lot of firms right now are just developing checklists for principal reviews, saying, I did this, I did this, I did this. I made a financial plan, I checked his goals, and we discussed this, and this is why this is in his best interest, and they're including it with the new account documentation. Primarily, my view is that the principal reviews are not going to be that different, because when you're conducting your principal reviews, you're looking at the information. I mean, if it looks out of whack, you're going to ask some questions. But generally, as long as the information looks pretty good, you're going to take it on faith that the representative has done the right thing. So I don't think the principal reviews, again, you're going to look at some other information, maybe a new checklist has been added in, is going to be that much different than for best interest than suitability. The real issue is going to be when compliance does their spot checks or does their branch reviews and whatnot. How are they gathering this information? Because they're going to pull up these documents and they're going to say, okay, this looks good, but now how can I look at the financial plan? How can I look at some more information about that customer? Where is that? Where is this all going to get aggregated? And again, that's where Rob was talking about, having a system where you can just be able to access this information. So it's, the reps be able to access it, possibly principal reviewers, compliance. You need to be able to get all this information together so it can be accessed. Next slide, please. So another pain point is grandfathered accounts. When I first looked at the rule and read it, I was thinking, oh, grandfathered accounts, that's great, where if you entered into some kind of compensation prior to April 10th and you're receiving trailers or 12B1 fees, that's great. We can keep that intact and not bother with it. Then you started thinking about it. Well, okay, so what does that mean? That means I really can't, other than telling them to hold it or maybe sell it, I really can't do a lot with that grandfathered account. So that brings up another point. So do I just ignore those? If I'm talking to my client, I have some transactions that are grandfathered. I can't touch those. I can't talk to them about it. I can't tell them buy more. So grandfathered accounts, though, on the face of it may seem great, I think have some problems that you need to really look into. And along those lines, especially if these grandfathered accounts are held at direct to fund, many firms are doing business direct to fund where the account is held there. And there's a big information gap with getting when money gets thrown, added into an IRA, like a rollover. The firms need to know that information, and they're not exactly getting that. So again, you're looking for some kind of solution where you can get information from maybe these mutual fund partners. Next slide, please. So what's going on in the industry? Well, we already know that Merrill Lynch, and then I just saw JP Morgan this morning and said, we're no longer going to allow compensation-based business in IRA accounts. And Merrill has even gone as far to say that advisors have to stop purchasing mutual funds and RIAs currently. Edward Jones says we're not going to allow mutual funds in any commission-based IRA accounts. LPL said they're going to cap fees at 5%, mutual funds at 3%. So you see a lot of the big companies are already coming out with how they're going to handle it. You have to decide this for yourself. But one of the things, the problems I have with the Merrill Lynch model is that you're eliminating choice. And I think a lot of firms, especially if you have independent contractor model with your reps, you want to be able to have choice for your reps and for your clients. The point is that these gauntlets are being thrown down by these big boys because they're saying to the industry, especially the mutual fund and VA companies, I need help. You're going to have to step up and tell me what you're doing so I can comply with reasonable compensation, with documentation issues. And I really think that's what's going on here. They're really throwing down the gauntlet to some of their vendors and saying, if you're not going to help me, this is how we're going to handle our business going forward. Next slide, please. And just recently, again, we received the first batch of FAQs from the DOL, which was great. There was 34 questions. It hit on a lot of areas, the level C fiduciary. It talked about compensation and grandfathering, discussed the principal transaction exemption, and also PT 8424 in regards to fixed annuities. If you haven't seen it, you really need to look at it. I don't think there were a couple points that were brand new and gave us some additional information, but for the most part, I think most of the information was pretty much what everyone's been assuming is going to happen. And hopefully we'll just be getting more and more FAQs coming out from them. So now that I'm done, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Kosman, who's going to discuss training, which is an integral issue right now in how to comply with this.
Great stuff, Tom. Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to jump right into this. From our perspective, what we're seeing, the focus on training is often pushed aside during these policy building and brainstorming sessions that firms are having across the country. But interestingly enough, many firms are highly focused on this area because all of this work we're talking about dovetails into creating the protocols and the policies and procedures that are going to be guiding the advisors in the course of their work and provides a positive and hopefully successful experience with the clients. I mean, that's ultimately our goal, is to be successful. What I'm seeing unusually is many firms are taking a very proactive approach in communicating the rules and educating their advisors before they're placed in the position to communicate these rules to clients. Without these education programs and this communication to the advisors, firms in a supervisory nature may have a difficult time proving the appropriate training and ongoing fiduciary supervision aspects of the rule. Further, and from our perspective, most importantly, without the necessary client-facing training, advisors will be faced with questions they just may not be able to address without direction from the firm. So what we're saying is this: the training thresholds used to develop new programs will most likely require thinking outside the scope of current transactional-based compliance solutions and focus on the provision of the actual advice-giving parameters. So traditionally, transactional-based compliance is circular around the product itself and the suitability aspects associated with that. And right now, that traditional training is most likely not going to be sufficient to prove the supervision and compliance aspects of the conflict of interest rules. So looking at the typical compliance parameters such as age and time to retirement and risk tolerance doesn't give enough information to prove the advisor acted in the best interests of the client. More here needs to be done. So the focus for many firms is developing their advice-based parameters, whatever they may be. Some of those may be understanding the client's overall goals for that account, for their future, and understanding how the account will be managed. A sticking point here is, for example, A retirement account that will most likely sit in a fixed allocation for a long period of time, if that's the recommendation, will need to be established type-wise appropriately. For example, if there's very little trading, very little activity in the account, perhaps it's less expensive to place that account in a brokerage type of an account rather than a fee-based account. There's going to have to be some sort of analysis and documentation of that particular question to prove that this recommendation was in the best interests of the client. So that's just an example of what we mean here by advice-based parameters. Once the firms have set these parameters, they have to implement what they're doing through a training program. What we're seeing a great deal of is interest in highly technology-based program, very interactive, online, and moduled, very much like a college syllabus, which can be, these modules can be easily documented, they can be efficiently documented, the content can be periodically updated, and most importantly, from one centralized, documented location or source. So everybody that's facing a client gets the same information. Firms are wanting a combination of technology and live coaching versus just training, more coaching here. And particularly those firms that are siloing their client-facing ERISA consultants. So those that are specializing in this particular marketplace, some of the firms that I'm working with are really focusing on the coaching aspects rather than just a single, one-off sort of training. Once firms have decided on their compliance protocols, and this is really important, once that gets decided how you're going to do the work, how you're going to be compliant, the development of the advisor and firm story starts to solidify. A clear and positive communication plan that doesn't overwhelm the client and shows the firm's expertise is the ultimate goal. So here we need to be incorporating, firms need to be incorporating thoughtful questions, and the primary one should sound something like, what path to compliance will ensure a seamless experience for your clients? Because your clients are going to see some waves from all of this happening. So when you're implementing and deciding on your compliance policy, how is this going to ultimately affect your client? How are you going to communicate what you're doing to your client in a positive way? From training aspects for the advisors, are firms incorporating client-related questions as well? They need to think about this. So for example, an advisor firm where your advisors may not have been functioning as fiduciaries and now will be. You can expect your advisor to face a series of questions from their client and plan sponsors, such as what does this mean to me? What services are you now delivering that you weren't delivering before? Well, if it's the same thing, why weren't you a fiduciary before? That's going to be a very difficult question to answer, and advisors need to be prepared to answer that. Questions like, how does the compensation changes affect plan costs? If we're switching from one area to the other, how does this affect my participants? How are they going to see this? And then further, if you're a new fiduciary, did you have specialized training to become a fiduciary? What did that look like? And probably the most feared question across the field is, why weren't you a fiduciary before the rule change? So, and then interestingly enough, one that I've gotten a lot of is for firms that are going to be implementing a negative election process for the contractual issues, how are you going to communicate that to your clients? So the ultimate goal here is are your advisors prepared to answer the questions they'll be facing regarding these issues? And the list of questions goes on and on and on, but I'll just leave it there for now. So what's been clearly evident to us, excuse me, in the training and compliance world is that if these two units, training and compliance, work together using technology, they can track the training programs. They can track when they've touched their advisors. They can track what they've said. And then more importantly, these parameters, these advice-based parameters, can actually be monitored and audited on an annual basis with the existing compliance programs using these technology tools. So this is really important overall to understand that they're no longer two different units. Training and compliance here are going to work together to make sure that they're supervising fiduciary processes appropriately, they're monitoring the communication to the advisors, and then ultimately they're using this information to audit the progress and to notate any nonconformities and address the issues up front, then trying to mitigate risk on the back end. So those are my initial impressions of what firms are doing right now. Thanks for letting me speak. This was really great content.
Great, thank you, Mary. So as you can see, there are many things to think about and incorporate into your answer. More importantly, one size does not fit all, and it really depends on your firm and their goals. So at this time, we'd like to move into a section just answering some questions. So again, as a reminder, if you would like to submit a text question, please do so in the control panel, and we'll read off a few of those questions. Let's go ahead and start with the first question for our panel. Now that we have President-elect Trump, do you think that this is the end to the DOL? Please feel free, any of our panelists would like to answer that one.
I think that the death knell of the DOL is a little premature, kind of like the way we didn't think there was any way we were going to get a President Trump. There's a lot of other, I think, issues on his plate, and there were some other considerations. It's not that easy since the rule is already final. It's not that easy for Congress to get rid of it. They're going to have to get a 60 count in the Senate to be able to overturn a regulation. The odds are they're not going to have that. So I think if you're really hoping for that to happen, you're going to be quite disappointed when April 10th comes rolling around.
Yes, and I would add that the industry has largely gotten behind it. And Tom, you gave some examples in your presentation. Merrill Lynch, not just restricting or eliminating the use of certain products in IRAs, but also putting major marketing dollars behind a campaign announcing that they're doing that. So I would agree completely.
And not only that, President-elect Trump doesn't come in until mid-January. This rule takes effect, starting April 10th. All of the firms thinking that this is going to be addressed in that short period of time would probably not benefit from that line of thinking, because they think it's going to go versus the not, just through sheer timing mechanisms. So the law stands as it is. Thinking that we're going to get out of it is probably not the best course of action.
And just real briefly, I think all of you are on the right page. The other thing I would add to that, and this is from a different perspective, would be that Trump made his campaign on fighting for the little guy, fighting for the America, fighting for the small business, and this, if you recall, the DOL law was put out there to claw back $17 billion in fees that are taken out of retirement accounts. So it's kind of hard to say I'm for the little guy, but I'm going to give it back to Wall Street. That may not look very good. But I probably would tend to agree a little bit more with Tom on the sense that he's got bigger fish to fry right now before he gets to this.
All right, thank you so much. It looks like we have just a couple minutes left. Let's try to get one more question in here, which looks like it does have a couple different parts. The other day, the DOL stated that they considered deferred payment bonus agreements as a violation of the conflict of interest rule, and some wirehouses have rescinded their offers to advisors. Now, is this legal? Because the regulation is not in effect yet. What are they going to do about the recent deals, and are they going to nullify them, or do they have the authority to do a clawback on monies paid?
I think in the FAQs they basically did say there's if it's a legally binding contract, there's not a lot you can do about that other than do supervision on what's occurring. So I don't know how that's going to work. But I could see where they're concerned about it, but right now the guidance they're getting is if you've entered into a legally binding agreement, they have to recognize that.
Right, any responses from anyone else? All right, well, it looks like we're about time to go ahead and wrap up our webinar today. I'm going to type the message in the chat in case you have any other questions. We'll ask you to please contact Melissa Watts at melissa.watts@emphasis.com. You'll see that in your chat section. So I want to thank all of our panelists and thank everyone for attending today's webinar, Where Are You on the DOL Compliance Journey? And once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would really appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Emphasis and our presenters, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.